In this video I'm going to create a very simple ASP.NET server control. So what I've done was actually create a solution that contains two projects. They're both ASP.NET web form projects. One I called the server control app and the other I called the server control test. I'm going to use the server control test to actually be the assembly that will contain our server control, and we'll test it in the server control app. So what I'm going to do first of all is delete this web form because we won't need it. And what I am going to do is go ahead and select add new item, and I'm going to scroll down to web custom control, and let's name this control test .vb. Now when I do that, I get a lot of code already written for me, a template of a very basic control. Before I actually go in and explain all the code here that was created for us, I just want to show you the workflow of how to get your control up and running. So let's just do this for the time being. Let's just save exactly what they have there, and let's go and do a build server control test, which again is our server control itself. Now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and close the control test.vb, and I want to add this to my toolbox. So what I'm going to do is right click in the general tab and select customize toolbox. I'm going to go to .NET Framework Components, select Browse, and then I'm going to navigate to the inetpub www root server control test. Wherever you saved the server control itself, look in the bin directory and you should have the server control test.dll. So that assembly is what contains our server control. I'm going to go ahead and click open, and you'll notice that it's in our list and selected, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And when I do, you can see the control test. It's grayed out right now because we don't have a web form open in the main area. So let's go ahead and open up our web form 1, and then let's drag and drop our new control onto that service, our control test. Let's go ahead and put it right in the middle of the form. And let's take a look at the properties. Notice that by default we get a bunch of properties. That's excellent. And let's, in our text, go ahead and just type in hello world. And notice that there's designer support. And we can go ahead and change things like the font and even the font style. Change it to Arial, and we'll make it extra large. And we can change all the properties that we like to. And just to show that we can also use it from code, I'm going to drag and drop a button onto the design surface and call it begin change, and then here I've already typed up some code. Control test 1 dot text equal changed it in code. You can see that on line 4 it gave us the reference to our control, protected with events control test 1 as server control test.control test. Great. Okay, let's go ahead and test this and see what happens. So our browser pops up, and remember we put it in the middle of our form. However, it appears over here to the left hand side. Also, although our hello world property did take, notice that the font is not Arial and it's not extra large. I'm going to go ahead and click the change button, and that worked. It did change the value in code. The reason why some of the features didn't work was because this was a template for us to complete. It wasn't intended to be a control in and of itself. And so there's lots of things that are still left up to us to actually implement in the control. Let's take a look at some of the code that was generated automatically for us as we added the control test.vb to our project. I'm going to go ahead and unpin some of these windows here. Let's go ahead and get started. First of all, you'll notice on line 4 that there is an angle bracket, which leads us to believe that this is an attribute that's applied to something. So let's go over to the right and see what it's an attribute of. In this case, it's an attribute of the public class control test, which is our server control. So let's see what the attributes are that are applied to our server control. First of all, there's a default property, which is basically specifying that the default property for our component is the text property. Now, if you recall from Visual Basic 6 and earlier, the default property allowed you to just specify the control name, like so, in this case, and go ahead and, because you knew that text was the default property, you could just do something like this. You wouldn't have to type the word .txt. However, you can see that it doesn't quite work in Visual Basic.net. And the reason is because you can't create parameterless default properties. So if, for example, and this is a big if, this is not going to work, but I'm going to show you the syntax where this would work. If we were to have multiple items in our control test, we had like an items collection and sub3.text equals whatever. In that case, if we made the items collection the items property the default property, then we could do something like that. Your default properties can only have parameters. In this case, the parameter is the third element, or 3. So you just may want to keep that in mind, that if you want to provide that kind of functionality, you can do it. So this is really, to be honest with you, quite useless, because the default property of text will never work. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. The next one is toolbox data. Whenever you drag and drop a control from the toolbox into the designer, it actually generates a registration tag for that component, especially if it's a custom control, and it actually puts a tag that specifies that instance's property. So for example, let's go over to our web form 1 and take a look at our hello world example, and notice that we have something called ccc1 : control test. Well, control test is definitely ours, but where did it get this ccc1 from? Well, as you can see here at the very top where we registered it, or actually VisualStudio.net did, it created a tag prefix called cc1, or custom control 1, and defined things like the namespace and the assembly where it got it from. So what we're doing in the actual code here is defining what that tag should look like. And as we add properties, you'll notice that in this case there are some additional properties that have been added. For example, the ID and the style and run at server. In this case, since we defined the text, it's set it there, the font names, the font size, and so on. But by default, if we were to drag a new one onto our designer surface, whoops, it wouldn't have all those properties. It would just have the ID and the style and some very basic things. So if we look here, we notice that there's this open bracket 0 close bracket, and again here in what resembles that ending tag, this is what Visual Studio is going to replace with the actual tag prefix. So let's continue on. We'll notice that our control inherits from system.web.ui.webcontrols.webcontrol, and that gives us many of the properties of just the basic foundational web control, like all the font information and things of that nature, the height and the width. And if you want to see what it really does, just hit the F1 button on web control, and you can see all the basic members that come automatically whenever you inherit from it. Next, we see that we have a private property called text, and then we have a public get and set method to be used as the text property. And so it has a couple of attributes as well. For example, whether or not it's bindable, and this specifies whether property is used for binding or not. It can have either bindable true or bindable false. When it's true, that means it's two-way binding, so that not only can you bind the value from the database, but you can bind the value back to the database when you're trying to update or save it back to the database. If it's set to false, that means there's only one-way binding where you can just retrieve the value, but it's not used to update the database in the case of data binding. The next is category, and this defines where this property will appear whenever you look at it in the property window. So let's go back to our web form here and take a look at our hello world, and then pull out our properties window, and notice that our text property does indeed appear in the appearance section. We can create our own sections, and we can add items to those sections, and we'll show you how to do that in a future video, but it's done with attributes. Almost everything that you do with custom controls in terms of how it looks in the property window and how it appears visually is done with attributes. Let's go back and take a look at the next attribute. Is the default value. By default, whenever we add a new control test component to the web form designer, notice that it's actually, the text is empty, but we could default that to any value that we wanted to. We just have to type it in here. And then you should have seen the get and set code before. That shouldn't be new to you. But what is new to you is this last item here. Protected overrides sub-render. So the render is a method that sends the server control content to an HTML text writer object that's provided for us right here. And so we can write to the output stream or the output HTML text writer, and that will get rendered onto the client. So in this case we do something fairly simple, output.write, but there's actually quite a bit that can be done here in terms of adding attributes and styles and all kinds of different information, the begin tags and the end tags. And we'll spend an entire video just on this part alone, because this is where really you're going to get to do a lot of the magic when you create your custom controls. So in my mind, whenever you're creating custom controls, there are really three parts to the process. The first part is actually making sure that it looks right in Visual Studio.net, and you do that again with the properties and with the attributes like we talked about earlier. Then the second part is making sure that it renders correctly, and you do that with the render, overriding the render method on the web control class. And then the third thing that you would do is manage the state. So there are things like putting things in view state or saving it in another way, and we haven't even touched the surface on that particular topic, but we will. So hopefully this was a good overview for you on how to create custom controls in VB.net. Same ideas can be applied to C#. You'd apply the same attributes and approach development the exact same way. And the next video in this series, we're going to talk about more about the rendering of your control and the options you have there. Thank you.